Sarah moved before she thought, before the cold reached her mind and told her what she was doing, before anything in her that was cautious and careful and accustomed to surviving quietly could interrupt the single animal fact that a small body was out there on the ice and it was not moving and it was his. The frozen surface of Lake Draveth stretched gray and silver beneath the afternoon sky, and the ice at the shore had already begun to speak in low crackling protests as her boots found the first seam of it, and still she moved. Not running. There was no use in running on ice. She moved the way she moved through everything, steadily, weight distributed, breath controlled, each step placed where the surface looked most certain, reading the color of it the way she had learned to read everything in this pack, by looking at what other people had stopped bothering to notice. The pup was a small heap of dark fur, perhaps 40 feet from the northern bank, where the reeds had been cut back for winter and the wind came in unbroken across the water. She could see the rise and fall of him, faint but there, a living signal beneath the stillness, and she fixed on it and let that rhythm carry her forward. The cold came up through the soles of her boots and settled in her ankles and moved higher with each step. The ice was not singing warnings now, it was whispering them. She had been carrying a length of rope from the supply shed, the same rope she had been coiling all morning in the storage yard behind the pack house, a task that belonged to no one in particular, and so had fallen to her, as most tasks did. She had not let go of it. That was not courage. It was simply the instinct of a person who had spent years treating every ordinary object as something that might matter later, because she had learned early that she could not afford waste, and she could not afford unpreparedness, and she could not afford, above all, to be in a situation that required help she had not already built into her own two hands. She looped one end around the base of the iron mooring post at the lake's edge as she passed it, paying out the line behind her. She did not look back. The pup's name was Fen. She knew this because she knew the names of all 3 of King Aldrich's remaining children, in the same quiet way she knew which hinges in the great hall needed oil, and which roof tiles had been patched improperly in the autumn, and which stores of dried herbs would not last the full winter. She was the Pax Omega record keeper, and she kept records of everything that mattered, and several things that did not, and she had decided long ago that the king's children mattered whether or not anyone had asked her to notice them. Fen was 4 years old. He had his father's coloring, dark gray fur when he shifted, dark eyes when he did not, a serious set to his small face that on a child of 4 looked more like concentration than grief, though she suspected, in the way she suspected many things she had no right to know, that grief was what it was. His mother had been gone for 2 years. His older siblings were 7 and 9, and had learned by watching their father how to carry things without speaking about them. Fen had not learned that yet. He was still at the stage of wandering toward things that called to him without knowing why. The ice moved beneath her, a long, slow flex, not a crack, not yet, and she stopped and waited and breathed and then continued. She was close enough now to see his small chest moving, close enough to see the pale blur of his face turning toward her, his eyes open and tracking, not unconscious, only cold and frightened and stuck. One of his legs had broken through a thin patch and refrozen partially in the shattered ice, trapping him. He had not cried out. She noted this about him, filed it away in the category of things that concerned her. A 4-year-old who did not cry out when injured and trapped, and alone on a frozen lake, had already learned something he should not have had to learn. She reached him and crouched down on the ice beside him, weight low, and she looked at his face before she touched anything. "I have you," she said. She kept her voice level and plain. "Don't move. I am going to get your leg free. It will hurt a little. Then we are going to walk back to the bank very slowly. Can you do that?" He looked at her with those dark, grave eyes. "You're the one from the records room," he said. His voice was steady, which cost him something, she thought. His jaw was working with cold. "Yes," she said, You know my name, he said. I know your name, she said. She worked quickly, her hands following the line of the ice around his leg, feeling where the refreeze had locked him. She used the edge of the rope's carabiner clip to break the thinnest sections, and her bare hands for the rest, and the cold was extraordinary by then. A burning thing that moved up through her fingers and palms and settled in the bones of her wrists, and she stayed with it because there was no other choice, and because she had made her calculations before she stepped onto the ice, and this was still within what she could endure. She did not hear the second set of footsteps until they were close, until the ice shifted with a weight that was not hers and not the pup's, and she looked up, and King Aldrich was crossing the frozen lake toward her, not at her measured pace, at his own, which was faster and more careless, and furious in the particular way of a person whose terror had arrived before his thinking had. She looked at him and said nothing. She turned back to the ice and finished freeing the child. The rope she had tied to the mooring post stretched behind them all the way to the bank. The king reached them and did not speak. He gathered Fen up from the ice without a word and held him against his chest, and his eyes were on Sarah, and she met them once and then looked back at the bank and began moving toward it. They walked back together, not slowly, not quickly, at the pace the ice allowed. It was the first time King Aldrich had ever looked at her directly. She was fairly certain it was the first time he had known she existed. She was wrong about that, but she would not learn so for some time. The pack house at Draveth Hold had been built against the mountains southeast, face 300 years before Sarah was born, and it showed its age the way old things do, not in ruin but in the particular density of accumulated use, in surfaces worn to a polish that no craftsman had intended, in doorways where the wood had compressed at the center from centuries of passage and where a person of middle height could stand without stooping. But a person of the king's height could not, which was perhaps why the king used the eastern entrance and always had. Sarah knew this because she had catalogued the structural reports for this wing of the hold when she first arrived, 8 years ago, newly designated and newly placed, carrying a single canvas bag and a letter of appointment that had been issued in the name of a pack elder, who had already forgotten he had signed it. She was 26 now. She had been 18 when she came to Draveth Hold from the provincial settlement at the mountain's base, selected by no one in particular for a role that had been vacant for 11 months because no one else had wanted it. Omega record keeper was not a position anyone sought. It required long hours in a cold archive room with inadequate oil for the lamps, meticulous attention to accounts and histories and land records and treaty documents, a tolerance for the particular loneliness of work that was essential and entirely invisible, and enough practical knowledge to serve as a secondary reference for the Hold's administrators when the proper archivists were absent, which they frequently were. The work suited her. This was not the same as saying she enjoyed it. What it meant was that she was good at it, and good at it in the specific way that mattered. Not showily, not in a manner that invited comparison or comment, but in the solid, unornamented way of a person who simply does the thing correctly, and moves to the next thing, and does not require anyone to notice. No one particularly had. For 8 years Sarah had inhabited the margins of Draveth Hold the way a draft inhabits a room, felt occasionally, never quite located, attributed to some structural fact rather than to a person. She ate in the lower hall with the administrative staff and the service pack. She slept in a room on the north-facing side of the residence wing where the light came in at a low angle for approximately 4 hours a day, and where the frost on the windows in deep winter took until mid-morning to melt. She wore the same 3 wool tunics in rotation, and her boots had a split seam on the left heel that she had repaired 3 times, and intended to repair again rather than replace, because the leather had broken in and she trusted it. Her wrists were ink-stained in the permanent way of a person who worked with documents long, enough that washing ceased to make much difference. She did not mind these things. That was the truth of it, and she had arrived at the truth carefully, over years, making sure it was not resignation she was mistaking for peace. It was not resignation. It was a clear-eyed understanding that her comfort in this life was proportional to her usefulness within it, and that usefulness was something she controlled, and that control was the only reliable form of dignity available to her at her designation and her rank. She was an omega in a pack court. The room's instinct dismissed her before she opened her mouth. She had learned not to wait for the room to change its mind. She simply did the work. The archive she kept was exceptional. She knew this because she had compared it to the records of the 3 holds in the surrounding territory, which she had been permitted to review during an administrative review 2 years prior, and hers were better organized, more complete, and cross-referenced in a manner that reduced retrieval time by a significant margin. She had noted this in her annual report, and no one had responded to the notation. She had filed the observation and moved on. After the lake, things were different, not loudly different. Nothing announced itself. But the morning after, she pulled Fen free from the ice and walked back across the frozen surface with the king at her side in total silence, the head of household staff. A beta woman named Karis, who had acknowledged Sarah's existence perhaps a dozen times in 8 years, left a cup of heated spiced tea outside the archive room door. There was no note. Sarah drank the tea and returned the cup to the kitchen and said nothing about it to anyone. But she noticed. She noticed everything. Fen came himself. 3 days later. He appeared in the archive doorway in the late afternoon, when the light through the single window had gone to amber, and she was at the table with the winter inventory of preserved stores. And he stood there for a moment without speaking, in the manner of a child who has decided to do something, and arrived at the doing of it, and found it slightly larger than expected. She waited. She did not call him in, and she did not send him away. "My father said I had to thank you," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "He said I did." "You can come in or not," she said. Either way, he came in. He sat on the low stool near the bookshelf that she used to reach the upper records, and he looked around the room with the serious attention he gave to everything, and then he looked at her. "Why do you know my name?" he said. "Because it matters," she said. He considered this for a moment with what she recognized now as his habitual method of processing. Silent, thorough, unhurried. He was very much his father's child in that. "My sister didn't fall through," he said. "I went to look at the ducks. The reeds move even in winter. I didn't know the ice was thin there." "The ice is always thinnest near reeds," she said. "Now you know." "Yes," he said. He looked at his hands. "It was cold." "It was," she said. He came back the next afternoon, and the one after that. She did not make too much of this. She let him come and go as he chose, and she worked while he was there, and occasionally she answered questions, and occasionally she asked him one, and she did not treat his visits as anything other than what they were, a small person finding a quiet place and being allowed to stay in it without being managed. This was, she suspected, rarer in his experience than it should have been. She did not say so. She was aware, with a precision she tried not to examine too carefully, that she did not know exactly how she had explained to herself why she had stepped onto that ice. She had reasons. The rope, the method, the assessment of risk. All of those were real and considered. But underneath them was something she kept filed under instinct and declined to open, further, because what was in it was this. She had known it was his child, and that had been enough. And the fact that it had been enough before she had even thought was a fact she was not ready to explain. The scent of the king had reached her on the ice that day, wind-carried and brief, cedar smoke and cold iron and something older beneath it, something that had been in the stone of this mountain longer than the hold itself. She had noted it. She had filed it. She had closed the file very firmly and gone back to the winter inventory. But she had not forgotten it. She would not forget it, and that, more than anything, was what concerned her. By the second week after the lake, the rumors had begun in the quiet, persistent way of pack gossip, not shouted but seeping, traveling the way cold travels, finding every gap and settling in. The Omega from the record's room had walked on to Draveth Lake alone to free the king's youngest from the ice. The king had followed her out. They had come back together, the three of them, without a word exchanged. Sarah was aware of the rumors the same morning they started, because she was aware of most things that moved through the hold, and she neither confirmed nor denied them, because they were accurate and required nothing added. What she had not anticipated was Fen. Not Fen himself, but the fact of him, the daily, consistent, observable fact of a 4-year-old appearing each afternoon in the archive doorway, sitting on her footstool, and staying for an hour or more while she worked. Packs are attentive organisms. They notice patterns, especially patterns that involve the children of their king. By the end of the second week, Sarah had become, without intending it and without being consulted about it, a person the pack had begun to locate. A fixed point, someone whose name could be said with a specific placement attached. The archive, the lower corridor, the kitchen yard at first light, the lake bank on the morning she had walked out onto the ice, rather than as a vague designation attached to a function no one thought about. She found this uncomfortable, not because she wanted to return to invisibility. She was practical enough to recognize that visibility, managed correctly, offered protections that invisibility did not, but because she understood, with the instinctive accuracy of someone who had spent years reading a pack's social structure from the bottom of it, that becoming visible in the way she was becoming visible had a cost, and that cost would arrive in the form of people who had investments in the existing order and did not want her placed inside it. What she had not predicted was how it would arrive, or how soon. She was in the east corridor on the 15th morning after the lake when she heard the voices. Not raised voices. That was not how things worked at Draveth Hold, where the king's own composure set the register for everything, and no one shouted, not even in anger. They were controlled voices, careful and quiet, and carrying the particular weight of people saying things they wanted heard by the right ears and not by the wrong ones. She was apparently neither category, because they had not checked whether the archive corridor connected to the east corridor at the far end, which it did, and which she knew, and which they did not. One voice belonged to Lord Cavan, the pack's administrative overseer, a position that sat between the King's Council and the daily operations of the hold, and that had been held by the same bloodline for 4 generations, and that Cavan occupied with the particular conviction of a man who had been told from earliest memory that he was essential. He was not unkind. She had always tried to see him accurately rather than with charity or hostility, and what he was, accurately, was a man who had built his sense of self on a clear map of what belonged where and who belonged to whom, and where the boundaries lay, and who was now looking at a map that had developed an unexpected feature and was not pleased about it. The other voice was his administrator, a woman named Tess, whose accuracy Sarah also tried to maintain. Tess was competent, careful, and loyal to Cavan in the way of a person whose security was built on his, which meant her interests and his aligned perfectly, and her actions were therefore predictable. "The visits cannot continue," Cavan said. "It reads incorrectly. An Omega with unsupervised access to the royal children. There is no precedent for it, and there does not need to be one, because there is a clear policy framework for this exact category of concern." "She hasn't sought access," Tess said. "He goes to her. He is 4 years old," Cavan said. "He goes where he is received. The question is whether she should be receiving him." The question, Sarah noted, was not whether Fen was well, or whether the visits helped him, or whether any harm had occurred. The question was categorical. She was an Omega. Unsupervised contact with the king's children was a policy matter. Policy matters had documentation. Documentation created records. Records, once created, had weight. She walked past the corridor junction without slowing her step. She had the bearing documents she had needed from the East Wing. She returned to the archive. She pulled the relevant policy framework from its shelf before she even sat down, because she had catalogued it 4 years ago, and she knew exactly where it was. She opened it on the table and began to read. Not anxiously, systematically. The policy governing unsupervised access to members of the royal bloodline by pack staff of designation Omega or below had been written during the 3rd year of the previous king's reign, in response to a specific incident involving a specific individual that Sarah had catalogued in full. She remembered the incident. She also remembered something else about it. The policy had been amended 14 months later by a secondary council order that was stored not with the primary policy, but in the annex records under the heading of Administrative Clarifications, Reign 17, a section that no one had touched in 11 years because the indexing on that shelf was, until 8 years ago, effectively impenetrable. She had re-indexed it in her first winter at the hold. She had cross-referenced the amendment to the primary policy. She had noted the cross-reference in the margin of the primary document and dated her notation. She found the amendment in 4 minutes. She read it twice. She pulled the original incident record that had precipitated the amendment. She noted which council members had signed both documents. She noted which of those council members were still alive, which were on the current council, and which had voted last season on the boundary treaty that Cavan had authored. Then she made a second cup of tea. She had started keeping a small pot in the archive after Karis's initial delivery, an accommodation to the fact that the archive was cold and the walk to the kitchen was long. And she sat with it and thought about how to proceed, not angrily, not with satisfaction, though she felt, in a quiet corner of herself that she tried to keep from being too frequently visited, something that was perhaps satisfaction's practical cousin, the specific calm of a person who has prepared for a long time for something and finds, when it arrives, that the preparation was sufficient. The policy framework had a mechanism for challenge. She had always known it had one. She had never expected to need it. She pulled the documentation for the mechanism and laid it next to the amendment and the original policy, and began drafting the formal submission. She was halfway through it when she heard the footstep in the corridor outside. Not Fenn's light step, not Karis, not anyone from the administrative wing. Something else, a different weight, a different cadence, measured and deliberate, and belonging to a person who moved through a space as though the space already knew him. The archive door was open, as it always was during working hours. She did not look up from the submission. King Aldrich stood in the doorway. She was aware of this without raising her head, the way she was aware of most things in the archive. Through peripheral registration, through the change in air, through the particular quality of the silence that gathered around a person whose presence occupied more room than their body, she kept writing. "You know about Cavan's concern," he said. "It was not a question." "I heard him this morning," she said, "and I'm preparing the formal challenge documentation." She finished the sentence she was on and looked up. He was exactly as he had been on the ice, large and controlled, and wearing his authority the way old buildings wear their age, not as decoration, but as structural fact. He was also looking at her with an attention she had not seen directed at herself before. Not curiosity, something more careful than curiosity. "The amendment to the policy framework renders the concern procedurally insufficient," she said. "There is also precedent from the 22nd year of the previous reign that is directly relevant. I can have the full submission complete by the end of the afternoon." He was quiet. He looked at the table, the documents spread across it, the careful layering of records and cross-references, the ink still drying on the submission she was halfway through. "You already knew about the amendment," he said. "I indexed it when I arrived," she said. 8 years ago. "Yes." He was quiet again for a moment, in the particular way of someone processing, not information but implication, the realization behind the information, the thing the information meant about the person who held it. She did not help him process it. She waited. "My son," he said. "He told me you said it was because it mattered," knowing his name. "Yes," she said. "He has been asking me," Aldrich said, and he paused, which was not, she had observed, a thing he often did. "Whether you will always be here." She looked at him levelly. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know," he said. That was not satisfactory to him. "No," she said, "it wouldn't be." He looked at the documents again. His hands were still at his sides, large, controlled, doing nothing, which she was learning was the way he managed impulse. Everything he didn't act on lived in the stillness of his hands. "Finish the submission," he said. "Bring it to me before you send it anywhere else." "Yes," she said. He left. She held the stillness for a moment after his footstep receded, and then she looked down at the submission and the mark site on the side of her neck, where no mark had ever been, and where she had never expected one, had gone warm in a way she could not explain, a slow, spreading warmth that had nothing to do with the archive's temperature and everything to do with the fact that he had been standing very close. She covered the spot with her hand for a moment. Then she moved her hand and continued writing. She did not examine the warmth. She filed it in the same place she had filed the scent from the lake, in the part of herself that she kept very organized and very shut, and she wrote until the submission was finished. The challenge submission, when Sarah delivered it to the king's study late that afternoon, was 22 pages long. She had included the amendment, the original incident record that had precipitated the policy, the council signatures on both documents, the precedent from the 22nd year of the previous reign, and a 3-page cross-referenced analysis of how the amendment interacted with the current policy framework in a manner that rendered Kavan's procedural concern not merely insufficient but specifically addressed by Kavan's own predecessor in the oversight role, whose signature was on the amendment, and whose reasoning was recorded in full in the administrative clarification. She had also included, without editorial comment, a clear record of Fenn's visits to the archive, times, duration, and the observable fact that in each instance Fenn had arrived and departed without escort, had not been detained, and had left when he chose to. The king read it the same evening. She knew this because he sent word to her through the household page at the 8th hour that the submission would be reviewed the following morning at the administrative council meeting, and that she should be present. She had never been to an administrative council meeting. She spent the hours between the page's arrival and sleep sitting with the instruction, which was not anxious sitting. She had no anxiety about the substance of the challenge, which was solid, but a different kind of sitting, the kind that accompanies a change whose dimensions are not yet clear. She was being called to the table, not as a subject of discussion, as a participant. In the morning she pressed her best tunic, which was not remarkable but was clean and whole, and she went. The council chamber was the same room she had delivered records to 6 times in 8 years, and had stood in the outer passage outside perhaps 40 times more, waiting to hand documents to someone who would carry them inside. The inner room had a long table of dark wood with 12 chairs, and 10 of them were occupied when she entered, and one was occupied by Lord Cavan, who looked at her as she came in with an expression that was not surprise. He had been told she would attend, but was something more controlled than surprise and less controlled than indifference. The king was at the head of the table. He did not acknowledge her entrance with anything beyond a single measured look. She took the empty chair that was indicated and sat. Cavan opened the session. He was good at this, clear, procedurally fluent, presenting his concern in the language of institutional welfare rather than personal interest, which she noted with accurate appreciation for the craft of it, even as she prepared her response. He cited the original policy. He did not cite the amendment. Whether this was oversight or decision, she filed under an open question. When he was done, Aldrich said, "You have reviewed the submission?" "I have," Cavan said. "Your response to the amendment?" A pause. Brief. "The amendment applies to residential staff of permanent appointment. The record keeper holds a provisional designation under the original administrative framework. She has held the position for 8 years," Aldrich said. "The appointment was never formally confirmed at council." Cavan said, "There was an administrative oversight at the time of her placement." This was true. She had known it for 6 years. She had not raised it, because it had never required raising. And she had spent 6 years assuming it was the kind of technical gap that institutions carry indefinitely and that only becomes important when someone needs it to. She acknowledged privately, underestimated the timeline. She opened the second folder she had brought, the one she had assembled in the small hours of the morning, when she woke at 3 and lay still for a moment, and then rose and returned to the archive, because she had remembered something. The formal confirmation of appointment for record keepers in packs, governed under the Mountain Compact, requires council acknowledgement, she said, not council vote. She laid the relevant section on the table and slid it toward the center. The council acknowledged my appointment in the 8th month of my first year, when the boundary review required my attendance to provide archive access. The acknowledgement is recorded in the session notes of that meeting. She had placed a marker on the page. She watched Cavan's expression. He did not change it, but his hands, which were folded on the table, tightened very slightly. The acknowledgement functions as confirmation under the compact's definition. The amendment therefore applies. The room was quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, the particular quality of quiet that falls when something has been said that is accurate, and everyone present knows it is accurate, and the question is not whether but what follows. Aldrich looked at Cavan. "Is there a further procedural question?" Cavan was silent for a moment, then, "No." "Then the challenge is upheld," Aldrich said. He looked at the table generally, briefly, and then his eyes settled on Sarah. "The record keeper's access is unrestricted. Her appointment is formally confirmed at council." He looked at Cavan. "Have the confirmation documented and filed by end of week." Cavan said he would. He said it evenly, which she gave him credit for. After the council session ended and the room had mostly emptied, she sat for a moment before rising. Not dramatically. She was tired, in the way of someone who has maintained a great deal of composure over a long morning and finds it leaving now that it is no longer required. The table in front of her was bare except for the 2 folders she had brought. The fire at the room's end was burning steadily. She heard the door close as the last council member left. Then she heard it open again, and the footstep, and she did not need to look to know. "Cavan will reframe," she said. "Not today. In a month or 2. Something else." "Probably," Aldrich said. He came and sat in the chair beside her, which was not something she had predicted. He was close enough that the air between them carried his scent, cedar, cold iron, that older thing beneath, and the mark sight on her neck went warm and immediate. She kept herself very still. "You knew about the appointment gap," he said. "For 6 years," she said, "and you said nothing. It hadn't mattered until now." He was quiet for a moment. "You walked onto my lake alone to reach my son," he said. "I had a rope," she said. "You walked on to Dravith Lake in deep winter with a rope and nothing else." "He was there," she said. "It was a manageable risk." She looked at her hands. The ink stains were as permanent as ever. The faint marks across her right palm from breaking the ice around Fenn's leg had faded to thin pink lines that would be gone in a week. "He didn't call out," she said, "when he was stuck. He was 4 years old and alone and frightened, and he didn't make a sound." Aldrich was still beside her, the kind of still she had come to recognize. Not absence, but the controlled containment of something very large, moving very carefully. "No," he said, "he wouldn't have." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. "He's learning it from you," she said. She said it without accusation. It was an observation offered plainly, the same way she offered most things. He turned and looked at her. And for a moment she was aware of something she had not permitted herself to be aware of before, something that lived in the air between them and in the warmth at her neck, and in the fact that he had sat down beside her when he did not need to, and in the fact that his hands were perfectly still in that way. That meant he was managing something with them, something that pulled toward her. She was an accurate person. She did not pretend she didn't see it. "I didn't know your name," he said. "Before the lake." "I know," she said. "I knew what the archive position was. I didn't know who held it." "That is generally correct," she said. "Most people don't." "It shouldn't have been," he said. It was a plain statement. Not an apology, too contained for that, too bare, but something more precise than an apology. A correction of record, offered as exactly that. She accepted it the same way. "No," she said. "It shouldn't have been." He stood then, and she rose a beat after him, and he looked at her and said, "Fen will come this afternoon. He asked me to tell you." "Tell him the stool will be there," she said. Something moved in his face, not a smile, not quite, but the faintest shift at the corner of his mouth that was perhaps what a smile looked like on a face that had kept its own counsel for a very long time. Then he left, and she gathered her folders and walked back through the long corridor to the archive, and the morning light was full on the eastern windows, and lay across the floor in bars of yellow gold, and she moved through it the way she moved through everything, steadily, without declaration, letting it touch her. He did not come back that day, or the next. He came back the third day, in the early evening, and what he brought was not a question about the policy, or a request regarding Fen, but something different. He came and stood in the doorway of the archive and said, "Will you walk with me?" Not a question, but not a command either. Something between them, in the register of a man who is accustomed to one, and is trying, with visible and somewhat endearing unfamiliarity, for the other. "Yes," she said. They walked the outer wall, which was the long path that ran from the hold's south face around to the eastern, overlook, exposed to the winter wind in a way that made it one of the few places in the hold where conversations were genuinely private. No corridors, no junctions, no places where the east wing met the archive passage. She had always liked this walk. She suspected he knew that, and then wondered if he did, and wondered how he would, and then thought about the way he had looked at the papers on her table 3 weeks ago, with an attention that had not been incidental. They did not speak for the first several minutes. She did not manufacture speech to fill it. He did not seem to want her to. "My mate died 2.5 years ago," he said, when the eastern overlook came into view and the mountains spread before them, gray and white and immense, the last of the winter sun laying thin gold along the ridge-lines. The bond severing was, he stopped, started again. There are things that do not have accurate words. That is one of them. She did not offer comfort. She did not tell him she was sorry. These were things he had not asked for. She said Fen would have been 18 months old. "Yes," Aldrich said. "He doesn't remember her," she said, "but he carries the absence, the way children carry things they can't name yet." "Yes," Aldrich said. He looked at the mountain. "He has talked about you more in the past 3 weeks than he has talked about anything in the past year. That is not an exaggeration." She was quiet. "I want to be honest with you," he said. He turned and looked at her directly, and the wind was cold and the last light was going, and his eyes were very dark and very serious. "The bond. I have been aware of it since the lake." She had known this was coming, and she had still somehow not fully prepared for the way it landed when it arrived. Not fear, something more complicated than fear, with more structural weight. She looked at the mountain and breathed the cold air and said, "So have I. I don't know what to do with it yet," he said. "I am telling you that plainly, because I think you deserve plainness more than I deserve to seem certain." She looked at him, that is, she paused, searching for the word, accurate of you. The corner of his mouth again, that minimal shift. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to understand that the answer changes nothing about your position here, about the confirmation, about Fenn's visits, about any of it. None of that is contingent. I want to be unambiguous about that. I understand, she said. Stay, he said. And then, because he was a careful man and a precise man and a man who had, she was beginning to see, spent a long time learning the difference between what he felt and what he was certain of. Not because the bond asks it, not because Fenn has decided you belong there. Because I am asking. Because I would like more time to know you. Because that is a thing I am choosing. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them, and the sky was going to deep blue above the peaks, and somewhere below the wall she could hear the early owls beginning. She thought about the ice and the rope, and the small grave face of a child who did not cry out. She thought about 22 pages of documentation, and an amendment she had indexed in her first winter, and kept for 8 years without knowing why. She thought about the warmth that had lived in the side of her neck for 3 weeks, and that was there now, steady and undeniable, and hers. Yes, she said. It was not spring when things settled. It was not spring when the bond was formally acknowledged, or when the council was convened for the second time to receive a notification that was not a question and did not require their agreement, only their record. That was late winter, in the quiet of deep February, when the mountain was still locked in snow and the lake was still frozen, solid, and the archive room still needed the lamp at midday. Cavan reframed his objections twice. The first time, the documentation Sarah had prepared in advance was sufficient. The second time, she had help, an old pack archivist named Rennick, who had served 4 kings, and who arrived at the council chamber with a letter case under one arm, and the particular authority of a man who had seen enough attempts at procedural manipulation to identify them by smell. He set his case on the table and said, without preamble, that the precedent in question had been set in the 31st year of King Aldric's great-grandfather's reign, that he had the original documents, that he had been keeping them specifically for an occasion like this, and that he would like the council to note that he was not surprised the occasion had arrived. Only that it had taken this long. Cavan did not attempt a third reframing. Whether this was wisdom or exhaustion, or a calculation about costs, she did not speculate about. She filed the outcome and moved on. Aldrich marked her in early March. There was no ceremony. She had not wanted one, and he had not insisted, and this was itself a small and significant thing, that she had been asked and her answer had mattered. It was quiet and private, and afterward she pressed her hand to the mark and felt it warm and pulse like something alive, and he watched her do this with an expression she had no catalogue entry for yet. She was building one. The morning of the first true spring thaw, Sarah woke before the light. This was not unusual. She lay still for a moment in the familiar warmth. 3 months, and she still sometimes surfaced from sleep, briefly disoriented by the presence of him, the specific gravity of a person she was still learning. And then she rose and dressed and went to the archive, because the spring inventory review was due, and she had always started it early. She was Omega record keeper of Draveth Hold, formally appointed, formally confirmed, bond-marked and claimed, and seated at the council table when the matter before it required her expertise, which was more often than she had predicted, and daily growing more often still. Fenn found her there at first light. He did not knock, he never knocked. He appeared in the doorway, in the small and certain way he had of appearing, having acquired somewhere in the intervening months a confidence that sat differently on him than it had in the fall. Less like a posture held against the cold, more like a thing that had grown inward and taken root. He climbed onto the stool. "Father says the lake is melting," he said. "The edges will go first," she said. "The center holds longer." "Can we go look?" She considered the inventory. She considered the light coming through the window. Early, gold, the specific quality of March light at altitude that meant the day would be clear and cold and luminous. She considered the fact that she had been keeping records for 8 years, and would be keeping them for a great many more, and that the inventory would be there in an hour. Yes, she said. They went together, the three of them, through the morning hold, and out to the bank of Dreveth Lake, where the ice had pulled back from the shore and left a narrow margin of dark, open water still and reflective. The mountain rose behind them. The air was cold and clean and smelled of pine and meltwater, and somewhere in the reeds a bird had returned from wherever birds went in the winter, and was making its presence known in the tentative, repetitive way of something testing whether it was safe yet to be loud. Aldrich stood beside her. His hand was at the small of her back, not possessive, not claimed, simply present. Fen stood at the water's edge and looked at the ice, and then he looked back at Sarah with that dark, grave, considered face that she had learned by now to read as attention rather than worry, and he said, "How long until it's all gone?" 2 weeks, she said. Maybe 3. He nodded and turned back to the water, satisfied, and she watched him and felt the weight of a winter survived, and a spring beginning, and the warm, steady pulse at the side of her neck that was as familiar now as her own heartbeat. And she did not think about what came before, or what might come after. She was here, she was seen. The morning was hers, and the lake was melting, and it was enough. It was not remarkable. It was simply the morning, and the morning was hers, and it was everything.